The new year has only just begun, but the Kremlin is already facing some unpleasant geopolitical results. Russia's looking less and less like a global power, and more like a country with limited regional influence. The situation in Venezuela and Iran, as well as the seizure of tankers, have clearly shown that the country's international standing has noticeably declined, and even Putin's inner circle can hardly argue with that anymore. If this trend continues, the consequences for Russian foreign policy could turn out to be extremely grim. Back in May of last year, Putin ceremoniously welcomed Nicolás Maduro to the Kremlin, emphasizing Venezuela's special status as a key ally of the Russian Federation in the Western Hemisphere. But just 8 months later, it became obvious to the whole world what that alliance was really worth. After Maduro was captured, Moscow was left in a state of shock for a while. First of all, the U.S. special operation turned into a real anti-advertisement for the Russian military-industrial complex. For many years, Russia had been supplying Venezuela with weapons, including the latest air defense systems. But none of that helped protect Maduro and his wife. Later, the foreign ministry declared full solidarity with Venezuela, and Russia's permanent representative to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, accused the U.S. of reviving colonial policies. The head of the Kremlin has remained silent all this time.
Putin's voice, the only person who truly matters in Russian politics, was absent immediately after the U.S. regime change operation. Unlike Chinese President Xi Jinping, who called the U.S. actions unilateral intimidation by Washington, Putin did not make an immediate and clear public statement about the raid. Although the strategic partnership between Maduro and Putin was presented by the Russian government as an expression of support for the brotherly Venezuelan people in defending against external threats, what happened did not provoke a strong reaction from Moscow. Based on materials from CNN.
Now, the prospect of losing power has also appeared before another of Putin's strategic partners, the spiritual leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini. The U.S. presidential administration openly states that they support the protesters, and the regime in Iran must be overthrown. And the head of the Kremlin is silent once again. In February 2022, the Iranian authorities were among the first to support the full-scale invasion of Russian troops into Ukraine, and not just in words. The regime supplied Putin's army with shells, missiles, and drones. Iranian specialists came to the Russian Federation and consulted with UAV developers. All of this was done with the expectation that, if anything happened, Moscow would come to the rescue. But both last summer, during the 12-day war with Israel, and now, all the partners have managed to do is express deep concern.
According to a Western security official, Iran sold Russia nearly $3 billion worth of missiles to help Vladimir Putin in the war against Ukraine. The purchases included hundreds of Fateh 360 short-range ballistic missiles, about 500 other short-range ballistic missiles, and approximately 200 surface-to-air missiles. According to estimates, since the end of 2021, Russia has spent the equivalent of more than $4 billion on Iranian military equipment, from a Bloomberg publication.
On January 7th, the Americans seized the oil tanker Mariner sailing under the Russian flag in the Atlantic, and another one, the Sophia, in the Caribbean Sea. The Kremlin once again responded with a deafening silence. Only the Russian Foreign Ministry made a restrained statement, saying that Moscow is supposedly monitoring the situation and calls for the rights of Russians on board to be respected. The tanker Alina has already become the fifth vessel seized by the United States. And again, zero reaction from the Kremlin leadership. Putin hasn't appeared in public, and his press office claims that he is supposedly working on an extradition agreement with the Republic of Djibouti. The so-called Z community has been freaking out for the second week in a row. Like, how could this happen? What about our repines? What about our status as a nuclear power? And now you can't even hide behind the excuse that we decided not to interfere in our partners' affairs. Here are a couple of examples of such posts on social media.
If you set aside the drooling and wailing, the fact remains, for the first time in modern history, the United States has made a public, insulting gesture toward the Russian Federation by seizing 2 Russian tankers. For the first time ever. Nothing like this happened even during Yeltsin's tricky times. This whole tanker situation is just so embarrassing, like secondhand shame. Life was so much better for me before 2022. I believed that Moscow had closed the skies over Syria. I believed in that 75% of new equipment when I would run to watch the parade instead of having breakfast. And now I know how things really are, and I can't answer for myself how or what I could do to help change it.
But the so-called Russian war correspondents never ask any real questions, like who brought the country to such humiliation, who built a system where tankers are left unprotected and crews are left defenseless. They also don't ask why the quick special operation in Ukraine that Putin announced has long since turned into a drawn-out war of attrition. Even the milestone of over 1 million Russian soldiers killed hasn't prompted them to question those whose decisions led the country to such losses.
When the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he promised Russians that they would do it again, send their armed forces westward, and achieve victory, just like the Soviet Union did against Germany. As of this week, the war that Putin had hoped would end in 3 days has now lasted longer than the Soviet Union's fight against the Nazis. What's worse, while Moscow is bogged down in the war against Ukraine, the global network of allies that Putin spent 2 decades building seems to be falling apart right before our eyes. From a Politico publication.
The White House administration is also delivering tangible blows to Putin's war machine through sanctions. After restrictions were imposed on Rosneft and Lukoil, Asian refineries, especially in India and China, began refusing Russian shipments. As a result, deliveries have been blocked and export chains disrupted. Now, the Russians are forced to keep oil on tankers that have essentially been turned into floating storage units. According to market estimates, 35 million barrels of Russian oil are currently accumulating at sea. Putin, of course, cannot respond symmetrically to Trump, neither for the sanctions, nor for the shadow fleet, nor for Maduro, nor for supporting the protests in Iran. All he is capable of is taking out his anger and frustration on the peaceful citizens of Ukraine. That's why, in the midst of severe frosts, missiles and drones strike critical infrastructure targets every day. But each such attack is seen by the international community as a sign of Putin's weakness.
The lesson to be learned from 1,418 days of genocide against Ukrainians is that the myth of Russia's strength and invincibility has already been shattered. Even with the support of China, Iran, North Korea, and such accomplices as Cuba and Venezuela, Russia, undoubtedly the largest military sponsor in Europe, will not be able to achieve a complete victory over Ukraine. The main reason for Russia's failure in Ukraine is not a lack of weapons or manpower, but arrogance, strategic miscalculation, and a gross underestimation of the enemy. From a publication by the Moscow Times.
Putin's military aggression no longer helps him create myths about Russia's might in any way, and with each passing day only further confirms his strategic mistakes and miscalculations. By the way, many experts believe that the number of detained Russian tankers will only continue to grow. The Washington Post writes that Trump is very angry with the Russian dictator after his lies about the alleged attack by Ukrainian drones on Valdai. Putin's tricks no longer work. They only provoke Washington to take tougher and more decisive actions.